Japanese politics are, we can agree that every new generation of politicians is worse than the previous one, not only in Japan. It's a global trend. And we can agree, in my opinion, at the big level, at the global level, there's a missing leadership. In the last years, we see a lot of issues on leadership, and Japan has have issues on leadership on transportation for a while. So I think one of the key issues that I found in transportation in Japan at the moment is that the Japanese government doesn't want to acknowledge, it cannot acknowledge that the current system is not sustainable. They know it and they mention it, but to enable sustainability, social sustainability of the transport network and mobility network, they can either at the moment chose to fully commit to the private sector and in a more American way, where eventually car transport will become dominant, or they could lean towards more public sector, the European system of public ownership, which they are not doing that. This is a key political issue, I believe, because the Japanese government this doesn't really want to take ownership and responsibility of the transport operations.
Welcome to today's session of Japan Expert Insights with Azarel Chamorro. I believe that if you are on LinkedIn, you have already come across his posts. He writes a lot about mobility as a service and mobility in general in Japan and other parts of the world. Azarel is a transport consultant based in Japan, a guest lecturer at the Polytechnical University of Valencia, and a smart mobility lead at Mirai Share. He works with quite a few international organizations in the field, and today we're going to talk about mobility as a service in Japan. Azarel, once again, welcome and thank you for being our guest speaker today. And there is an increasing development and interest in mobility as a service, not only in Japan, but throughout the world. However, the information available to the people who are not engaged in this field is limited and doesn't allow us to appreciate the utility and convenience that all the developments have provided so far. So I had a brief look at your career path as well, but could you please tell us a bit about yourself before we get into today's topic? Azarel?
Thank you very much. Okay, so good morning to everyone as well, and thank you very much, Maya and Timothy, for the invitation for today. My name is Azarel, and nice to meet you all, if I haven't yet so far. I've been working in the mobility field since ever, and the reason why I do so is because what in Japanese they are called techan, so I love trains, and that's the reason I came to Japan eventually. So today, just want to introduce briefly a few of the things we have been working in and a brief overview of the Japanese and global trends in mobility more than mobility as a service. I do really invite, if Maya and Timothy are good with it, to if anyone has any questions at any moment, to please feel free to jump and let us know. It's 8 a.m., so my brain is still like waking up. That may actually bring some fun facts into the table, but I will do my best to explain briefly over the overlook. That said, just before going into the topic, just 1 second about myself. So I was born in Spain, and I've been in several countries. I've been in France, I've been working in the UK, in China, and mostly in Japan on the field of mobility. As I say, the reason why I came to Japan 10 years ago, it was because I love trains, and I found that the best place in the world for learning about trains was precisely Japan. I do feel we might be all on the same page on this, but if someone believes there's another place in the world with better trains than Japan, please do let me know, because I will gladly go there. And I'm always open for suggestions. But yeah, I came into Japan as a student 10 years ago. I originally came for 3 months. It got extended for 6 months, then 1 year, then 1 year and a half. I think already 8 years. So the extension came a little bit long on that. But in the meantime, and these years in Japan, they have been some small breaks with other in other locations. I've been involved with the European Union and the German government in China on the digitalization of mobility and low carbon transport, the cooperation between China and Germany. I've been working in the UK on transport planning and resilience, and in Japan I've been involved when I came here in academia, in research, and now in the current company I work at, MiraiShare. MiraiShare is the largest provider of on-demand mobility platform. So we provide on-demand solutions, ride-hailing, ride-sharing, etc., for different clients across Japan. We do not only work for passengers, but we work with different fields in transportation, such as passengers and freight. And I will later explain that we are the only company in Japan, and to the best of my knowledge, in the world that we have mixed transportation of passengers and freight, which is something very interesting that only happens in Japan. Now that's the boring part of about myself. Now I would like to put in perspective a little bit about the world. So mobility is a very hot topic these days. I believe so, or maybe it's just because I work here. We have seen in the last 10 years that in 2008 the most important transportation technology in the last 100 years was born. I want to ask the audience if anyone has any idea about what kind of transport technology I am referring to. This is like 5 seconds questions. Anyone?
I have no idea, Azarel, and I'm ashamed to say this, but well, if anybody can help with this, you can share your question in the room chat or just come up on stage and say so. Timothy, do you have any idea? 2008 is the year.
Okay, David Sharp says containerization. No, that's actually 1960s, but no, thank you. You can try again, and please do.
I have no idea. I had to look up, what it meant, what we were talking about today. So I wasn't familiar with this term. So I'm completely ignorant, and I'm here to learn.
Well, so no need to talk to mobility as a service, just mobility in general. So the most important technology in the last 100 years, it happens to be in 2008, was the smartphone. The smartphone suddenly has become one of the key drivers of mobility technology. I would like not to say the word innovation yet, but technology. And Japan has not been an exception. Rather, the opposite has been a key driver of that. So, in the last 10, 20 years, we see that traditional mobility technologies, transportation technologies, such as public transport, cars, of course, and other means of transport have been some sort of being disrupted, if we can say, for good and for not so good by the smartphone technology. And by smartphone, I'm basically talking about the user interface of having all the convenience of all the available information convenience into the smartphone. But it's much more than that. So when I refer to smartphone, we talk also about all the digital services that the user do not have access, but has enabled companies and operators to enable all the different business solutions and in general innovation. Now, I do believe that Japan is a country with a extremely good mobility services. So public transport here is mainstream, and of course it's not perfect, but even in rural areas in Japan, you can still go to places by public transport where in other countries I've been in, it would be impossible. So I do believe that I do first need to praise Japan for being able to have this dense network of public transport, and in general to be very much focused on the experience, the journey, the travel user experience of the whole passenger journey. This is something that Japan has really done well, and it needs to be seen. But in the last years, things has changed. The socio-economic, and political reality of Japan has changed, as we all know. The population, aging society, etc., 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 plus industrial competitiveness, and so on and so on. Things has changed, and therefore we found that again we are again in a crossroad. And to the top of that, we found that there is an ongoing global crisis. I don't like to use the word crisis because it's not, but we can use it for now, called climate change. And it turns out that transportation is in most developed countries is the leading source of carbon emissions. In the U.S. since 2018, I believe, transportation is the largest emission source out of all the industrial sectors and energy. In Japan, energy is still the largest source because the carbon grid is the grid is carbon intense, but still transportation is is the third largest source. So we found that we need to decarbonize transport. We need to also use new digital technology. We may need to use digital technologies to increase the efficiency and user experience of transportation. And we also found that the society has changed, the reality of the society has changed. So the transportation reality that serves that society may also do so. So many things, right? So many things. And then we also have some, of course, geopolitical ongoing changes, which may disrupt, for example, some of the industrial players in the field, or how we can create more, or how we can actually rethink about the transport service provision. So many things. Now, I do appreciate in the chat, which I just realized we can actually open now. If anyone has any specific topic in transportation or mobility who feels might be interesting to bring up, please do so, because I may have been ignoring some. So please do write up if you want to talk, or if you want to specifically may focus on something specific on any of those topics. Now, coming back to Japan. So now I would like to explain a little bit more about what Japan has done in the last years to precisely tackle all these challenges, and what is the position of Japan in the world in this field, in mobility and transportation. So Japan in transportation, like in many other things, it has a very unique position. Japan is a relatively isolated country, even for transportation, and many of the things that they have been doing here for the last 150 years are not easy to find somewhere else, at least not anymore. So transportation has been for historical reasons. When Japan industrialized, transportation, railways at that time, and later other car companies, later other like new new transportation services solutions, it was a key industrial sector. And transportation, by definition, by default, not only in Japan, is a very capital intensive industry. That basically means it tends to conglomerate, it tends to scale up, it tends to massify and monopolize. So historically in Japan, this happens 100 years ago with the railway companies. After World War II, it happens also in the industrial sector with the car companies, and later on with recently with the more cross-verse companies. We found that we have very big players. This also happens overseas, of course, but in Japan, is a much more the strength of this scale of the industry is much more obvious. So we found that in Japan, all these big companies, all the railway companies, for instance, they tend to create different services across the multiple sectors. They diversify. It's very common in Japanese companies, as we all know, if we have been in Japan, to diversify, and this is good, because this has enabled Japanese companies to be the only ones in the world to be profitable. And if you're profitable, means you can continue investing. And if you can continue investing, means you can create better services and be relevant on time. This is something that the world could learn a few things from Japan. But this has been possible for some political reasons and some economic reasons. But it's not true anymore in many cases. As I said before, there are some challenges that this kind of like structure that has been served to Japan for the last 100 years does not hold anymore. The pandemic has been one of the key also signs for the industry to change, as well as digitalization. So we suddenly found that this system doesn't work anymore. So therefore, Japan, I think that one of the great things in Japan is that they realize about the need for change. But as we all know, Japan uh, doesn't like strong change, sudden change. So this is why Japan wants to go into some sort of like planned transition. For what would you need the important role of the government? So the government of Japan has seen many of these new digital solutions and also new business solutions as a key enable for the transition towards a new society, a more digital and connected society that provide new solutions for the ongoing challenges. Whether this is true or not is something it's that is a personal opinion, and of course we all have one. But I would like to strengthen that the Japanese government from the beginning has had a strong role in guiding the industry for good or for not so good. Since 5 years ago, the Japanese government started to start to draft the roadmap for example, autonomous vehicles, which is a hot topic at the moment, because the Japanese governments believe that autonomous vehicles in the future may have an important role, particularly in a society where there are already manpower issues. For your reference, for example, in Japan, the mean age of a taxi driver in all Japan is 60.5 years old. If you remove Tokyo, it's much larger. I work a lot with taxi companies, so I can tell you I've been with taxi drivers with 70 years old, which I personally think is a driving hazard. So the Japanese government believe that autonomous vehicles might be a solution in the future, and therefore is pushing hard on innovation in that field. Whether they're succeeding or not is another question. But more important than that, the Japanese government, more than focusing on a specific transport technology, is aware that innovation is much more than technology. So they are rather investing in a more holistic approach. So in 2019, the Japanese government launched a working group that enabled the Ministry of Transport and the Ministry of Economy. They started some programs to promote fostering innovation in transportation in Japan. That program is called the Smart Mobility Challenge, and it has been since then operating every year and promoting and funding some proposals on smart mobility technologies. By smart mobility technologies, this is a very broad meaning for the Japanese government particularly, so just assume that it's going to involve some kind of digital solutions. And the last call, by the way, it's ending in few days, if not it's already over. Sorry, it just ended last week. So it's good to see the Japanese government has some roadmap regarding like the promotion of all these technologies. The Japanese government has also launched a roadmap for air mobility, particularly focusing on the Osaka Expo for 2025. Again, it's up to your personal judge to evaluate if that's going to work or not. But at least there's some plan. But as we all know, the Japanese government and Japan would not be a fun place to be if it would be carried with a lot of problems. Politics is a big problem in Japan, and politics and business politics is also a very big challenge in Japan that is completely different from overseas. So Japan seems to be slower to embrace change. For example, last month, the Japanese government for the first time approved the dynamic pricing for ride hailing, which means basically that when you book a taxi online, as you do, for example, an Uber in overseas, the price is no longer fixed by the transport authority in Tokyo. So, for example, if you take a taxi, you will always pay the same price for the same ride. If you book for a taxi online, you will also do so. But now the taxi companies can ask you for a higher or lower price based on demand and all the features. This is something that has been there since basically 10 years ago, at least in many other places. But Japan took a long time because the Japanese consensus culture basically requires, politically speaking and socially speaking, requires that all the Japanese companies agrees for. And they didn't agree on that because they really didn't feel the need for until very recently, where again they're struggling. Taxi companies are struggling because the taxi sector, particularly, is a oversized one. They are struggling to find new businesses, so they think this can be a solution. And that applies to basically all their sectors in Japan. It applies to railways, it applies to buses, applies to aviation, etc., etc. Now, in my company, for example, we work a lot in rural Japan. We work also in urban Japan. We work in Tokyo, of course. And the rural situation is very different from what you're used to in the cities. In the rural areas, transportation is disappearing. And this is nothing unique to Japan. It's happening also in the European Union. It happens everywhere. But the difference is that in Japan, the government, for historical reasons, back in the 70s, there were some very important wrongdoing by the government. They don't feel themselves, they don't want to take ownership of transportation. They believe the private sector should be the main leading transportation provider, and therefore they are reluctant on really taking ownership and properly funding transportation solutions based on a social need, as for example happens in Europe or even in the US, where transportation is not considered an industry, but it's considered a social good. In Japan, it's a private operated good that has important influences, important consequences for the society. So the government actively try to find ways to support it. But at the same time, my experience is that the government of Japan is the first one to put pressure on local authorities for removing services if they are too expensive to run or they are not profitable, which they never are. So I think one key learning one key opinion I would like to express today, and I would like everyone to, whether agree or not with me, please do let me know in the comments, is that the Japanese government still has the mentality of the Showa era, the baby boomers era, of pretending to transportation companies to be operate on the same business conditions, basically to be profitable and self-sustaining. This is not going to happen in not so distant Japan. We already see that profitable public transport and profitable transport services, they are a rarity rather than a rule, not only in Japan but overseas. So the Japanese government, in my opinion, they should take ownership and step up and say, we just not want to provide funding for solutions to private companies. We also want to have a more harmonized and more structured policy regarding the role of the government and the local authorities. I don't think this is going to happen though, because Japan government, the Japanese politics work in a different way. But well, that was my lucky guess. I would like to see. The other thing is that there is some technological positiveness in the last years. So the Japanese government, I think, as important as for the Japanese government, they do recognize the role of innovation in business models, which is something that Japan has excelled in the field of transportation, as we can see with the railway companies. But I think the last years there has been a little bit too much focus on the technology. And we have been, in my opinion, if you look at the public funding, and if you look at my LinkedIn, you have a map with all the public funding, all the public funded projects in Japan in mobility. So I invite you to look at it. You see there's too much suboptimal investment. So too much subsidies on projects that they are not really innovative at all, or they are repeated all the time on the same precepts. And I think that can be a problem in the long term, because eventually Japan, we are seeing now, is running out of money for investment, public money. So whenever that money goes out, many of the private players, they feel themselves they are no longer able to provide these services. So in the long term, this may actually threat the sustainability of the transportation in Japan. On the other hand, I need to say that with the Smart Mobility Challenge, I found that, for example, every year, some of the projects survive and they get expanded, and some of them they die, which is great, because the idea of this challenge is to learn. So I think there's some learning progress by the Japanese government, but still I have the feeling there's a political issue regarding the ownership and the whole direction of the industry, which is, again, not only a problem in Japan, but also overseas. Overall, I didn't want to go very deep into any of these topics, but just rather launch a couple of opinions and a couple of ongoing trends. I think I would love to invite, if Maya and Timothy, are you happy with? I would love to invite the audience to join the conversation and specifically talk about mobility, and also what kind of how do you envision mobility. And I also very interesting if any of you could bring your personal experience on transportation and mobility, your daily experience in Japan, because I think the first thing I start the conversation with, and I always need to remember, is that Japan is a lovely place to be in mobility, despite all the challenges, all the future challenges and directions. And I think this is something that not many places can say in the world. So thank you very much, Maya and Timothy and all the audience. And I hope we can kickstart the conversation on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Azarel. What a great introduction. So while I was listening to you, I couldn't help but think that, or just nod my head and in agreement with you about how mobility here in Japan allows us to actually go about our everyday lives without realizing that there is so much service to the public. I never thought about, the ownership of these services, transportation services. It makes a lot of sense. Yes, the transportation companies here are private companies. They are not public companies. And what you said a couple of minutes ago made me think and realize the difference between the Japanese ownership and the European ownership in the field. But also, thank you for that. And while I was listening to you, you mentioned that there are some political issues. And I wonder, because we know how basically when you mean political issues, I thought that you probably had in mind political issues in two different meanings. One of them is politics within the industry and within the corporation. So that's probably, I guess you meant by business politics, and then the state politics here. And what are those challenges? Because we know, I remember, this is a story I remember, I heard a couple of years, no, maybe several years ago, about one of the Shinkansen lines here. So it goes, the Shinkansen that goes to, I think, Tottori, Shimane, and so on. And I remember that one of those Shinkansens has a stop somewhere in a very small city that actually doesn't have much of any industry. So it doesn't need a lot of transportation. Not many people live there. So well, basically the costs for building that station and for having the Shinkansen stop there was well, really tremendous as compared to the benefits it would provide. And what I heard was that one of the politicians in the Diet actually lived, or his constituency was there in that city. And in order to actually keep his voters happy, he exercised his power. And basically that station for the Shinkansen was built there. So I wonder if this is what you mean by politics, if there is any other way to think about it, and is there any solution to this in your view?
Yeah, I think you're talking about Kakue Tanaka.
Yes.
So, yeah, I mean, about the Shinkansen case, as I say before, Japan abhors the idea of public ownership and public investment, because back in the 70s, I mean, one of the reasons, there are a few reasons, but in the 70s, the Prime Minister of Japan, Kakue Tanaka, which is highly controversial for many reasons, he almost ended in jail. He developed a Shinkansen to Niigata because he was from Niigata, and he placed stations in the middle of nowhere because he wanted both. So he did it, but in doing so, he broke the economics of the Japanese National Railways, which was already struggling for other reasons, and therefore in 1987 it got privatized. So since then, the Japanese government, they found that the privatization was kind of successful, which I disagree. But for that reason, they think that, as you know, in Japan, the backslash is very bad. So whenever there is a bad experience, they don't want to repeat that. And when they have a good experience, they got reinforced in that. So they believe that that was the right choice. Therefore, private sector shall do the choices much better. That's the story with the Shinkansen you mentioned. But about politics, I was referring to the fact that Japanese politics are, I mean, we can agree that every new generation of politicians is worse than the previous one, not only in Japan, it's a global trend. And we can agree, in my opinion, at the big level, at the global level, there's a missing leadership. In the last years, we see a lot of issues on leadership. And Japan has have issues on leadership, on transportation, speaking of transportation, for a while. So I think one of the key issues that I found in transportation in Japan at the moment is that the Japanese government doesn't want to acknowledge, it cannot acknowledge that the current system is not sustainable. They know it and they mention it, but to enable sustainability, social sustainability of the transport network and mobility network, they can either at the moment chose to fully commit to the private sector and eventually end into out of the Tokyo, Osaka, big cities, and in a more American way, where eventually car transport will become dominant, or they could lean towards more public sector, the European system of public ownership, which they are not doing that. So this is a key political issue, I believe, in my opinion, because the Japanese government doesn't really want to take ownership and responsibility of the transport operations. I think this technological positiveness, the idea of believing that technology is going to save us, is going to save the whole challenges, it's not a good thing. I believe technology, mobility as a service, but out of mobility as a service, new transport technologies can be very positive, and they will definitely be part of the solution, particularly for the new trends where traditional transport doesn't provide a good solution to. But I do believe the Japanese government is having too much faith on that, and this is hindering potential advantages. When I work, for example, with the European Union, I found that in Europe, although Europe is a big continent, I found that there is much more comprehensive approach to transportation and to the idea of like what kind of like solutions have been done than in Japan.
Well, that's great. And I wanted also to ask you, because you mentioned, we have seen that trend, I believe, in other fields as well. The one which you just mentioned about governments and in general industries also putting too much focus on technology and ignoring the human element. So I wondered, what do you think do we, in mobility as a service, can we actually rely more on the human element, on the people who provide those services? Because, of course, technology is very important, but those services are for people and they should be provided also by people.
So something important, as mentioned before by you and me, in Japan, at the moment, nothing seems that that's going to change. Transportation provision is provided by private companies. Literally the legal goal of a private company is to make profits. Now, that means that the Japanese companies, they need to make profit, and that profit is subject to the social good. For example, in Europe, it will be the opposite. It will be the social good is the goal, and for that we set a level of profitability or financial sustainability to precisely keep this on time. Now, with that said, in Japan, it's a very industrial base. I mean, Japanese, not only in transportation, in other sectors as well, it's a very industry-led sector, which basically means that the public and the society goals need to be in line for the industrial sector. We see that in Japan, for example, the Nemawasi practices, we see that in transportation, all the different industries, they can conglomerate itself. For example, the micromobility, the scooters, bicycles, companies, they put together itself in a consortium to lobby for it. And they did it. They finally have achieved. They have the fact that you can get now scooters on the streets. The taxi company did the same. The on-demand transportation, I feel we did the same this year. The railway companies did the same. And this basically means that the society, I mean, the people they might not be listen or be in the same priority list for the government. Because again, the government, currently the government idea, for them the key issue, more than providing solutions for transportation, is to make sure that the current players do not disappear and stay relevant on time. So I do feel this eventually over time will need to change by their own necessity, and that also means that many players are going to die, which I think is great. I mean, as terrible as losing someone is, death is just a part of life. Is quite literally the goal, right? So companies need to live, they need to be born, they need to live, and they need to die. So how that transition is going to happen, I think is a key issue in Japan, and I think the government might need to focus more on how to lead the transition, how to, for example, consolidate the market around transportation in order to still provide a good transport solutions to the users, and see how this kind of like that wave is going to be for transportation companies, and that wave is going to open the way for new transport companies to come, new mobility services to happen, which I think is good. And I think Japan is to be honest, from a theoretic point of view, Japan has all the elements to succeed in that field, providing the political issues are, well, sorted out.
Well, right. I cannot agree more with you on that, but I have a few more comments and questions, but I don't want to keep David waiting either. So, David, hello.
Hello, can you hear me now, Maya?
Yes.
Ah, excellent. Okay, so sorry if the line's bad. I'm calling from Scotland at the moment, but wow, what a fascinating topic. Thank you so much for organising this, and Mr. Azarel, thank you very much for giving this topic. It's really quite interesting. So a little background on myself, just briefly. I've worked in Japan on and off for the last 15 or 18 years. First in English teaching, then a little bit of corporate stuff. And now I'm an engineering officer in cruise ships. I worked in container ships for a little while. So I've got a lot of interesting insights about this mobility topic. I've never really thought of it as a service before. But I've got like two points I'd like to make. First, about Japan itself. Like living in Japan compared to Scotland and the UK, I found the Japanese logistics and their kind of micro network of logistics to be really quite amazing. So when you convenience stores that carry almost no stock and you have little trucks going out to them, or like in the case of my wife's grandmother, she has a man from the bank who comes to the house once every 2 weeks in his little car. You have this whole network of transport across the country in Japan, which from a Scottish point of view is very impressive. So I don't know if you've got any comments on that, Azarel, about this uniquely Japanese micro network of logistics.
Thank you very much. Well, actually, I'm a member of the Scottish Rural and Island Transport Community. I was in Scotland last year for work because we are working in Scotland. There's an ongoing working group on rural transport, not only for passengers but for freight as well. And they see Japan as a great example of good practices. So we were involved in the Orkney Islands as well as Abermore and other places. So it's good to find others, all the people on the field. I think logistics is something they long time ago they sorted out. If you think about Japan invented somehow the just in time and other like industrial methodologies for solving the logistical issues here in Japan, lack of space, lack of other stuff, and so on. However, it's still logistics for freight for parcels is a big issue at the moment because during the pandemic, the number of deliveries grow exponentially, not only in Japan but all over the world. But in the number of people who can deliver and then the assets are not. So we found that the industry in Japan, all the big players in logistics, are actually struggling to keep with the demand. And for example, Yamato Kuroneko, one of the largest delivery companies in Japan, logistic companies in Japan, they raised prices last year for the first time in 20 years or something. And they were actually apologizing for doing so because they have enough drivers. So yeah, it's an issue. I do believe it's an ongoing issue that is going to require much more than technology. And there's no like magic pill for this. If you have a shortage of drivers, a shortage of people, you need to think, why do you have a shortage? Japan has a manpower shortage, I do agree. But also, if you think about, for example, how much is the salary of these people, you see there's not really competitiveness there, right? Same with the taxi industry. The taxi drivers, for example, in average, a male taxi driver in Japan earn about 60 to 70% less. 30 to 40% less than the mean worker, right? So it opens a lot of questions about like, do we have enough people or we just don't pay them enough? But of course, if you increase salaries, the cost of delivering goes up and so on. So there's a lot of issues. So yeah, transportation of freight and small deliveries is a very important ongoing issue. But I also need to say that, for example, and the delivery services, the Uber Eats, has been one of the most successful in Japan. Has been one of the most successful transportation mobility industries in sectors in the last year. So we do see that Japan really can surprise you, and where there are many challenges, sometimes some specific organizations have taken the lead on the opportunities in a right way and have actually make perhaps a positive from the industry, at least from the industry perspective, a positive value to that. So I think that yes, there are many things we can still learn in that regards, and I think Japan is actually doing kind of well in that field within the constraints, the social and economic constraints at the moment.
Yeah, sorry, Azar, that's something I wanted to pick up on about Japan doing relatively well. You mentioned in your talk about Europe and maybe America being a bit more innovative than Japan is, but from a maritime perspective, I have to say Japan's miles ahead of Europe, the UK, and America generally. I mean, maybe in terms of information technology, Japan, famously exports IT but doesn't do it very well at home. But on the maritime side, we have some excellent research coming out of Japan in ammonia-powered shipping. I don't know if you've looked into this at all, but be interested to hear, because recently we tried to convert over to LNG to get rid of NOx and SOx emissions, but obviously that's got geopolitical implications with Russia, which is not very pleasant. So maybe switching over to ammonia-based ships is something that Japan can lead us in.
Forget about that idea. I don't really want to open the conversation about ammonia, hydrogen, and new fuels on maritime transport, because then I think it will eventually not be about mobility, but about technology. I will say that we are very far away, if ever, to have those kind of like intercontinental shipping with ammonia. Although ammonia may actually work for the engines, but there's some issues around toxicability and feasibility and so on. But anyway, I do agree though that
I work with ammonia systems every day, so it's coming. I think it's coming.
I do agree though that Japan, in terms of maritime transport, because it's an island, it has no other choice. They have sorted out that kind of like logistics at that level. I don't think that's a key issue. I also think there's one of the things about supply chains is that Japan did much better than, for example, Europe on supply chains during the disruptions in the last 3 years in different sectors, semiconductors, automotive, and so on. Because in the Japanese culture, for example, automotive companies here like Toyota, in other places they will be more efficient based. So basically, they will get the cheapest bidder or the most reliable bidder. But in Japan, the big companies, they have some sort of like moral connection. So they instead like buy from many small providers. That basically means they are less efficient, but they are more effective because they are more resilient to change. If one of these small providers fails, the other still remains then. But on the other hand, they need to be more expensive because they are less competitive. But this is a cultural issue. So I guess I want to link this up with the conversation before about consensus and the need for innovation to come from consensus-based society. And also just one small comment. You mentioned that I say in Europe or the US is more innovative. I don't believe so. I do believe innovation is a big word and it's hard to measure. I think Japan is a super innovative country, just not because it's not in digital technologies doesn't mean it's less innovative. In fact, something that Japan does very well in transportation is the creation of new streams of revenues, funding, business model. And I think that the creation of new sustainable business model is literally the most important core of innovation, because technology is just a driver, it's just a mean. You can actually import technology if you need it. You cannot import business models that easily. So I'm very positive on that regard, in my opinion.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, David. Azarel, I really love what you said just now, that you can import the technology but cannot import business models, because every business model actually takes years and years of development and improvement until you can actually claim it and make it competition resistant, or anyway, make it your competitive strength. So thank you very much for making that point. I also was thinking that in this field, mobility as a service, in Japan, we have seen quite a few new players. And of course, the legacy companies here, the corporations like JR East, JR West, and of course, the other railway operators. But I believe that we can probably talk about these new, let's say, new players in a future session whenever your schedule actually allows you to join us again. So, but yeah, thank you very much for making also one more point, which I believe is very important and we don't think about it enough. Most of the time, it's about culture and how the culture actually is. Especially in Japan, it is basically the base of your business model and how you operate, how you decide to go forward. As you said, efficiency is something different from efficacy, and many Japanese companies choose one over the other because of the cultural values they hold and so on. So thank you very much for making that point as well, because if you want to do business in Japan and of course understand how corporations here operate and industries operate, you need to be prepared and understand that point as well. Yes, go ahead.
I think, Maya, something that I wanted to say And I think if you work in the industry in transportation, I think it might be also applicable to all industries. But in Japan, when you talk to the Japanese people involved in transportation, or the Japanese people involved, government people involved in transport, sometimes I found that they are. Japan is a very depressed country. Where I mean, they're all sad, right? So the first thing they will tell you is that, yes, we are not doing well in innovation in transportation, and they will forget about acknowledging the amazing transport network they have already achieved, but second, all the things they are doing mobility as service, which I haven't entered in the conversation in today because time, but in all the new mobility services, in all the new technologies, I think the fact that they actually experimenting, and some of them with of course more luck than others, but the fact they are experimenting and they are trying to really think from the perspective of the business models, from the perspective of the sustainability, financial sustainability, it's great. So one of the things I have done the most on LinkedIn and out of LinkedIn with the European Union is to precisely introduce what we are doing in Japan and what Japan is doing. And I always focus on the amazing, unique things that Japan is doing. Japan is the only place I know, for instance, in our case with my company, that they have mixed transportation of goods with people in the same vehicles. Is the only place I can see that they have linked transportation to all the different economic activities, which has created sources of revenues. Is the only place where you can see an amazing, for example, wayfinding solutions in overcrowded stations. Is the only place where you can actually see a full network of railways, buses that, despite belonging to different ownerships and have terrible poor governance, they still are functional and work well. So I think that the first thing that Japan needs to do is stop thinking of from the position of like, oh, we are not doing well because we are not the Americans, because they tend to compare to the US, which has a horrible transport network, if any, or comparing to the Europeans, but rather think about what Japan has achieved so far and what kind of directions are they taking. Again, it's not perfect, but once you think in that positive way, once you start thinking about, oh, we have achieved all these things and we could do all these things, I think the country itself will do much better. Because when I go abroad, people, they read my post and they say, wow, this is going in Japan, it's going in Japan, I would love to have this here, we could learn a few things from here. But if you ask a Japanese person, and I've been in these conversations in the OECD, for example, they will tell you, "Oh, Japan is being behind in innovation and in transportation," which basically makes me questions about what kind of measuring level are the Japanese people doing, and what kind of measuring level are other people overseas doing. I think also, by the way, I think this is common. If someone tell me that the best person to tell how bad a country is a person from that country. So if you go to Turkey and you ask a Turkish person, what do you think about Turkey? Probably they will tell you, oh, Turkey is a bad country. But if you go to Finland or Scandinavia, with these countries that are supposed to be perfect, you ask, oh, what do you think about Finland? They'll tell you Finland is a bad country. So the same. I think we tend to be very critic about ourselves and our own places, which is good, but we do not have the perspective to fully acknowledge all the achievements that Japan, in this case, Japan has done. And I think first thing, the conversation should be kickstart with explaining all these good things and this amazingly high level ground that Japan has this starting position that has at the moment.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much for that, Azarel. I also have more questions, but our time is running out. So let's stop here and hopefully we'll continue with talking about mobility as a service in Japan in the future. Great. So, Tim, a few words in conclusion, if you're available now.
No, I appreciate the presentation because, as David Sharp mentioned, I never thought of mobility as a service. It really, it wasn't even on my radar. So it, opened up a new way of thinking for me today. I don't know if you have time to answer this question. It's kind of a simple question, which shows maybe my ignorance. But, I popped over to your LinkedIn profile, Azarel, and, you list yourself as a transport consultant. So I was just curious, and we don't have to answer it today if we don't have time, but what is the general profile of your client? What value are they seeking from you and what value are you providing? Because in my mind, I'm trying to figure out, who are you selling your services to and what are some of the benefits?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think it's a question that at some point everyone in everyone's career you need to remake yourself, right, at different stages. So thank you very much. I think that that's a very big question, actually. So, if you're asking me from my personal perspective, because obviously I was not born here, then I could tell you that something that I think most people here should do, because I think they are mostly born overseas as well, is that you can provide a different perspective to the Japanese stakeholders. And in transportation is very local, so it's very global and local, right? So I've been in many countries. I've been in China, I've been in the UK, I've been in France. So when you can bring your experiences and your personal weight on how we can tackle transport to Japan, that can be a very big value for the Japanese companies to explore other possibilities. And of course, at the same time, when I go to Europe, I do the same. I explain what we do in Japan, and I explain how there's a different way to do things that Japan is doing, and that can open new perspectives, can open new business models, and so on. That's from a personal perspective as a foreigner in Japan. From the professional perspective, again, transportation in Japan and out of Japan is very institutionalized, right? So how you can provide value from the perspective of transport consultant, in my case, working in my company at the moment, it's a very important question. And in my case, in my company, we work in the on-demand mobility platform services, so IT from the SaaS platform. So it's a fleet management platform that companies can use for managing their the trip demand with their available fleet of taxis, buses, and so on, vehicles. So in that case, for example, I realized when I entered the company, most companies, most IT companies in the field of transport, they tend to focus about their solution, about the digital solution. For example, my company, I tell you, when I enrolled 2.5 years ago, the pitch was about how good you can use AI for increasing the efficiency of the dispatching of this vehicle dispatching services. That's cool. That's fine. That's nothing against that. Great. Now, after 2.5 years, I actually started to realize technology is something that everyone can develop. We have competitors in Japan. We have many companies doing the same, right? What kind of unique things you can bring to the table? So in my company, I realized we did some work in some specific fields, in some specific cities, for example, that it's kind of unique. For example, as I said before, mixing in rural Japan, in Okayama Prefecture, we mix in a taxi company that they can either they can transfer passengers and small deliveries like the Uber Eats, but in a local way with all the local shops, right? So that basically means you can create new sources of revenues from the local community, create more sustainable transport, because now you don't need to move people around when you don't need it, but you can actually bring services to people who may have, for example, mobility issues, like old people who cannot move. So those kind of like add values go in. Other things we have done, for example, we work with retailers to explore how they can actually increase their sales through the provision of transportation. I have a post on LinkedIn last week about how we can, for example, in Satsudora Holdings, which is like the largest drugstore in Hokkaido, we increased revenues by 5 times, but just by placing a taxi in rural Japan. Because in rural Japan, in Hokkaido, it's very cold, so people could not go to the shops. So we found there's a value there. So now the pitch is not about the technology, which everyone has, but about how specifically we can provide value back into your business, in this case, from a more economical and rational perspective, and how that actually can grow your business and make you more sustainable. Because really, I found that in Japan, the word of like sustainable in time, it's a very big thing. They want to be alive for a long time. Everyone wants to live long. So I think this is a key point as a transport consultant you need to make. I don't help you on the solutions of the technology, but about the innovation, the true innovation, how you can actually, that technology, provide a value back into your core business and retrofit it.
Thank you. That cleared things up a little bit. Appreciate that.
Thank you, Azarel. Great. Well, it's 8:59, so this is the time when we usually close the room. Thank you very, very much to everybody who stayed with us, listened to Azarel, and joined us. And we'll be here once again Wednesday morning next week, but before that on Sunday morning again with Timothy Langley on politics, Japanese politics. Azarel, again, thank you very much indeed. I wish you a great day and, a nice reminder of the week.